gathering on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. Since time immemorial, the Coast Salish have called Whidbey Island home, stewarding this bountiful land for millennia. We honor Coast Salish elders, their descendants, and future generations who continue their lifeways on and around Whidbey Island. So there's a lot going on. We left last time on Coupeville 101. We left right around 1857, I'd say, is when we left the story last time. And we talked about the arrival of American immigrants. There's a lot of wrangling for dominion that's going to be going on during the 1850s and even into the 1860s. I'm going to show you some of the things that were caused by American settlers arriving, one of them being the formation of crown colonies north of the border. So this is the crown colony flag for Vancouver Island, and this is the crown colony flag for British Columbia, and this is the official flag of the Confederacy. We're pretty used to seeing stars and bars, but that's actually a battle flag. You can tell by looking at this one why this didn't make a good battle flag. It's got the original seceded states in the ring in the blue field, but it was too hard on the battlefield to tell which country this actually was representing, so they got rid of it. Or they didn't get rid of it, but they stopped using it in battle. So just to recap, Oregon Treaty of 1846 is when the boundary between the United States and Great Britain territories was established here. And in response to that treaty, Great Britain decided that having the Hudson Bay Company out here as a chartered commercial enterprise was great, but if they really wanted to make sure that that boundary didn't become more fluid, and give more room to the Americans, they decided that it was time to establish a colony with actual government, not just commercial interests. So that's what led to the formation of Vancouver Island as its own crown colony. There you go. Oh yeah, so I do have to backtrack just a little tiny bit. We left poor Isaac Eby after his unfortunate death in 1857, but you might remember from last week that he was a fearless Hudson Bay Company fighter, and he really was doing all he can to help the territorial government push the British out of the area. So from his vantage point at Whidbey Island, he could certainly see the Hudson Bay Company establishing the Bellevue Sheep Farm on San Juan Island in their bid to plant a flag, so that when they actually got around to deciding where the San Juan Islands belonged, that their establishment would help make it American or British territory. Isaac Eby was the customs collector. He wasn't having any of that. So the Bellevue Sheep Farm had hardly been established when he journeyed over to South Beach and tried to collect customs duties from the Hudson Bay Company for importing all their sheep. So it became, it's the kind of Keystone Cops thing that seems to have colored everything that happens on San Juan Island in those days. It's easy to not take it seriously, but he left a deputy customs official there despite the protestations of the British. And when they tried to arrest the deputy, he pulled a knife on them, a gun on them, and told them that they'd have to kill him if they wanted to get rid of him. And so the British government or the HBC in Victoria had to complain to Isaac Stevens to pull their overzealous customs collector off if they wanted to avoid a war. So Isaac Eby gets a little bit of credit for starting the tension that was going to lead to the Pig War in 1859. The Bellevue Sheep Farm manager was so exasperated by Eby and his deputy with his knife and his pistol that he wrote such a farce. If this is what is called law, then it is plainly rum law. So they did pull Isaac Eby back, and as far as I can tell, it's the last time he persecuted the Hudson Bay Company. So you might remember too that I said when Isaac Eby was killed that it created a mass exodus of settlers from the territory here. People were really terrified. This was a really high profile, equivalent to one of our political leaders being assassinated. But the exodus didn't last very long, because not long after, in 1858, gold was discovered in the Fraser River, just north of the border. So what happens now, of course, is that all those disappointed prospectors from California are going to start rushing the border. Now, the Hudson Bay Company, it's now a crown colony of Vancouver Island, is going to try to catch these the rush of prospectors that's coming over the border. I don't know if you ever saw Blazing Saddles, but there's this crazy scene where they try to erect a toll booth in the middle of the prairie. And it's kind of like that. They try to get the prospectors to come through Victoria, and he's trying to intercept them at the mouth of the Fraser River, so that they have to pay, they have to go through all these bureaucratic processes to access the gold fields. Well, you know how Americans are. So the Americans weren't having any of that. So you can see here, this white line, they immediately started the backdoor trail called the Whatcom Trail from Bellingham into the gold fields, so that they wouldn't have to deal with the British regulations. So it was estimated that while there were about 500 people of European descent living on Vancouver Island, at the height of the gold rush, there were 30,000 prospectors charging into British Columbia territory, which wasn't yet British Columbia territory. But of course, now it's going to be. So this led to the formation of the Crown Colony of British Columbia in 1858 as a way of solidifying that boundary, no matter how many prospectors came over. And in another 8 years, in 1866, the two colonies will be merged into a single British Columbia Crown Colony. And in 1871, it'll become part of Canada. So at any rate, British Columbia can thank Americans for forcing them to become part of Canada. Yeah. So just, I want to quickly go through the San Juan issue, because it did feed into what's going to become tension between Great Britain and the United States during the Civil War. So it's 1859. One of the results of the gold rush was that a lot of these prospectors, of course, not many of them ever did very well. They decide they would be coming through the area, and they would be finding places where maybe I'll try to settle here, maybe I'll try to homestead here. And so there were quite a number of Americans who found San Juan Island and decided they were going to try to make a go of it here, despite the fact that it was disputed territory. So they're still waiting to see whether the Americans are going to get the blue boundary there, or whether the Brits are going to get the red boundary there to distinguish which country those islands belong to. Well, of course, those of you who have heard of the Pig War may know that the trouble all started when an American farmer shot a Hudson Bay Company breeding boar, and it started a chain of events that led to not fisticuffs with the actual farmer, but with all the American squatters rising up in arms at what they considered abuse by the Hudson Bay Company, threatening to send the poor farmer to Victoria for trial because he wouldn't pay for the pig. So the next thing you know, the army down in Steilacoom is sending Captain George Pickett's 9th company from the 9th Division from Fort Bellingham. They completely pack up Fort Bellingham and move it about 14 inches away from the Hudson Bay Company on San Juan Island. So this did not go over well with the British authorities in Victoria. And so the next thing you know, there are British warships that are now floating offshore of San Juan Island, pointing their big guns at the US Army there. So I don't know if any of you have ever been up there. It's a National Historical Park on San Juan Island that is there to commemorate what ultimately was a peaceful resolution of a boundary dispute. But among their media that they use up there, these are from panels that are up at American Camp. You can see in In the upper diagram, taken from American Camp, on the left-hand side, there are 2 of what were 5 warships that the British had to use to scare off the Americans. And then there is the lonely USS Massachusetts on the right-hand side, with Major Granville Haller and his men from Fort Townsend, who were there to try to support Pickett. So here they are building a redoubt, which is still there, to protect the army from those big guns. Now, think about it, really. There's 461 soldiers, there's 14 field cannon, and there's 8 32-pounders on the American side. The British have, they have 5 ships of war, they have 70 guns, and they have 2,100 sailors. So we have to kind of admire George Pickett's moxie to look at this situation where he's up on the high looking down at the warships and say, we'll make a Bunker Hill of it. So Haller was on the USS Massachusetts trying to support Pickett. Haller and Pickett did not get along. Haller actually outranked Pickett, but Pickett had been sent by superiors down at Fort Steilacoom, and Pickett would not let Haller land to help out. And this is really a beginning of sectional difficulties. You'll see we're not very far from the Civil War here. Granville Haller was from Pennsylvania and George Pickett was from Virginia, and they don't like each other at all. So, and we'll find out later, I mean, we won't find out because I'm not going to make you read this, but Haller was always really upset with the way Pickett behaved, his bravado instead of his attempts to negotiate to bring a resolution, and later wrote this pamphlet that was published called San Juan and Secession, wherein he said it was all the Southern officers that tried to make trouble with Great Britain, and their reasoning, he felt, was that they were trying to start a civil war, or not a civil war, a war between the United States and Great Britain, so that it would be easier for the South to secede because they were distracted by war with Britain. There are other officers in the Army who felt that the opposite was true, that they were trying to provoke a war with Great Britain so that the South and the North would have a common enemy to fight. I don't think anybody's ever thought that either of those reasons actually held any water. But at any rate, eventually, the international brouhaha blew over when the Secretary of War, General Winfield Scott of Mexican War fame and War of 1812 fame, was sent out to try to mediate between the 2 countries. And the result of that mediation was that the 2 countries decided they would jointly occupy San Juan Island until negotiations could take place and ascertain what the border was going to be. And as it turned out, that joint occupation lasted till 1872, which was long after the Civil War was over, when they got Kaiser Wilhelm I to mediate, and he ultimately gave the possession of the San Juan Islands to the United States. So I have to tell this little story about Winfield Scott. When he was in his older years, when this happened, he was a very large man and had never stopped getting larger. And he had a lot of issues with mobility that some of us can be sensitive to. And the only way that they could get him on and off the vessels was to hoist him like cargo with a crane. And it was such trouble for him, and probably a little bit humiliating too, so that when he came to San Juan Island to help the British, to negotiate with the British, he never got off the boat. So he never actually landed out here, though he came all the way around the Horn and all the way to the Northwest and never got off the boat. Anyway. Okay, and then English camp was established the next year on the other end of San Juan Island. Okay, so the Civil War is coming. It's coming, and what does it mean for the people out here in the West? And I think I mentioned last week that most of the settlers, the American settlers that came out here, were probably going to be Democrats. That's where the the energy was, especially with the gold rushes. A lot of settlers were coming from the South. A lot of them were coming from the Midwest, but even those that were coming from the Midwest were often people who had not been born in the Midwest because it was very new territory. So their family loyalties go beyond that. You can say they come from Missouri, but where's their family culture really coming from? So here in Coupeville, you can see this is a map of the donation land claims of 1850 and 1855. All the blue claims are made by people from New England. The one purple one is from Thomas Coop, who was from Nova Scotia. The pink claims are from the mid-Atlantic states, and the green ones are from the South. And these are, there's really, even the people who came from the Midwest generally came from the mid-Atlantic states. And so the only real Southern family that you have is the Crockett family that were actually culturally from the Southeast. So we can go back to see what were the Ebys doing. How did the Ebys feel? We know that the Ebys came from Missouri, so that can be a mixed bag. Originally, Isaac Eby's parents, his mother came from Virginia, his father came from Pennsylvania. So it's you can't tell their politics from that. I don't believe that the nuclear family of the Ebys that came out here were slaveholders, but they had people in their family that were. So when Isaac first came out and was scouting the Washington, or what was then the Oregon Territory, for the rest of the family, he had advice for an aunt who was considering coming out. And he writes to his wife, who was still back there, in regard to Aunt Martha bringing Viney, her slave, to this country, I think it best, although she recovers her freedom the moment she enters the territory, it is unnecessary to have free papers, as the very fact of migration to this country is de facto freedom. The fugitive slave law will have nothing to do in her case. And that was, he's referring to an earlier version of the fugitive slave law, not the one that really, no, actually, that's not true. I'm sorry. Let me take that back. The fugitive slave law, we're going to talk about a little bit more in just a minute. So the Crockett's of Virginia, we found in George Kellogg's book about Whidbey Island that Mrs. Walter Crockett had confessed to Mrs. Kellogg that they considered Uncle Tom's Cabin with its anti-slavery propaganda an awful book that they would not allow in the house. So it gives us an idea of how people, at least from the South and other regions possibly also, felt about the whole anti-slavery movement. And I do want to point out, as we start getting into the anti-slavery movement here, that there's a difference to them between anti-slavery and abolition. So an abolitionist would be someone who wanted to see the immediate abolition of slavery without any conditions. You're not going to drag it on for 30 years. It's got to end, and it's got to end now. So it was considered extremely radical. Anti-slavery people were generally, and this would include Abraham Lincoln, were people that felt like, well, we don't really have the authority to do anything to abolish slavery where it exists, but we are not going to allow it spread into territories in the West. So an abolitionist would have considered Abraham Lincoln a terribly conservative person because he wasn't for the immediate abolition of slavery. 1857's the Dred Scott decision, when the notorious Justice Taney made the decision that the class of persons who had been imported as slaves and their descendants had no rights that a white man was bound to respect. And the change that this made out here in the Northwest was that Oregon had decided that it was going to be a free territory, but this judgment in effect said you can't stop it. You can't have a no slavery here territory. So it really changes the rules for everything out here in the Northwest. Oregon became a state 2 years later, so it had more agency about its whether it had slavery or not. But for a territory, territories had very, very little agency in what went on in regards to slavery. So one of the results in 1860 was there was a government official, James Tilton, who'd come out as the surveyor general for the Washington Territory, and he was from Virginia, I believe, and he brought a young man with him, a 14-year-old African-American boy who he owned, and there were in Victoria anti-slavery agents, abolitionists, who caught sight of him and lured him to pursue freedom in Victoria. And I'll tell you a little bit about Victoria. Victoria in those days, you might remember James Douglas. He was the chief factor of the Hudson Bay Company. He became the governor of the Crown Colony of Vancouver Island. His grandmother, his lineage on one side of his family was from the West Indies, and his grandmother was an African. So he was extremely sensitive to the plight of African Americans. Many of African Americans who came west trying to get away from the prejudice and the regulations back east got to California and Oregon and found that the prejudice was just as strong and that their odds were just as bad. So it was James Douglas thought it would be very, very useful to beef up the population in his colony by inviting African-American refugees to settle Vancouver Island, where they would be welcome and free from prejudice. So the wonderful press, and we're going to see a lot of what the press has to say on Puget Sound over the next few slides, but they were very, because the young Charles Mitchell, the slave, had stowed away on the Eliza Anderson steamboat and made it to Victoria, was a huge scandal in the United States. They were very upset with the British for letting him get off the boat because he was, after all, another man's property. But in Victoria, they would not send him back. So he becomes basically the one person who survived the Pacific Underground Railroad. But the press, the way they write, I mean, it drops your jaw. The delightful, talking about how the boy was lured away by questionable people. The delightful prospect of the feasibility of becoming a free boy by running away from his master and making his escape to Victoria, and his degraded condition while a slave, all tended to inflame his mind. But until the arrival of a flashy-looking darky here from Victoria, the arguments were insufficient to wean his affections from his benefactors. There's a wonderful book written by one of our state historians, Lorraine McConaughey, with a partner of hers, Judy Bentley. They wrote the book Free Boy, which is a young adult novelization of Charles Mitchell's story. And he made it. He never had to come back into slavery. So we're going to be talking a little bit about Abraham Lincoln and what he thought about what's going on in the Pacific Northwest. And the truth is he didn't think much. He had been a big supporter of Zachary Taylor for president, and he was expecting to have some plum patronage job when Taylor was elected. And what he got offered was to be the secretary of the Oregon Territory in 1849. Now, we think of him as being the frontiersman, but he didn't like being the frontiersman. And the last thing he wanted to do after making a name for himself was to go live on the frontier. And not only on the frontier, but on the frontier that was ruled by Democrats, because the political system of territories was that you didn't elect your governors and such. They were appointed. All your big federal officials were appointed by whoever the president was at the time. So if the president was a Democrat, then all the political jobs were going to be run by Democrats. And that's where the seat of power was going to be. The last thing Abraham Lincoln wanted to do was come all the way out here. The last thing Mary Lincoln wanted to do was to come all the way out here to the Northwest and just take a political bloodbath as a lone Whig. He wasn't a Republican yet, but the enemies of the Democrats out here. They tried to lure him out here with governorship, and he wasn't taking that either. He did not want to come to Oregon. But he had a bunch of cronies in Illinois where he had had his political life up until then, and they weren't so shy about coming out here. So there were three of his very good friends that came out. Simeon Francis, who became the editor of the Oregonian in Portland, Anson Henry, who became an Indian agent out here and ultimately a surveyor general for the Washington Territory, and Edward Baker, who became a senator, one of the first senators from Oregon in 1860. He also went back to fight in the Civil War and was killed there. I believe he was the only US senator who was killed in the Civil War. But these were all Lincoln's friends, and they were there to kind of test the waters and help promote the Republican Party out in the Northwest. So when Lincoln is elected in 1861, this is not good news for people in the Northwest, especially the political figures. Joseph Lane was the first governor of Oregon. He was from South Carolina, so he was not going to be sticking around out here once South Carolina was preparing to secede. R.D. Golson, who was from Kentucky, was the territorial governor of Washington, and he could not even begin to imagine serving under Lincoln. He wrote in his resignation letter, unwilling even for a day to hold office under a so-called Republican president. With my cordial thanks to President Buchanan for the honor of its bestowal, I hereby tender my resignation of the office of governor of Washington Territory. And what I didn't put in the clip there was that he asked if they could post-date it a little bit so he could get his full pay for the year. So ultimately, Lincoln is going to appoint his friend, William T. Pickering, as territorial governor. And it seems like by the time Lincoln is done making all his appointments, that it's nothing but people from Illinois running what has been, up until this time, a Democrat people. And so they called it, every time a president would change administrations, and in those days they didn't run, I mean, it seemed that most of them, like Polk and Buchanan, these are all Franklin Pierce, they're all one-termers. So they call, the press out here called it the quadrennial shower of Egyptian frogs, when all the new appointees would come out to take over the government. One paper wrote, can Illinois furnish any more federal officials? There's room for a few more of the same sort. And Anson Henry wrote to Lincoln, the common talk about town now is that you have imported upon the territory another drunkard from Illinois. So the good news is, well, the good news for Lincoln's party anyway, is that this is going to lead to Republicans are going to be a president for the most part, with the exception of Andrew Johnson. They're going to be in power as presidents until 1885. So it's really going to change. This is the beginning of a big cultural political change in the Northwest. So as you can see by the uniforms of these fine guys, James Patton Anderson was the territorial delegate to Congress, obviously a Democrat. The Democrats, was he from Kentucky? I think he's from Kentucky, sorry. George Pickett's from Virginia, of course. He was the captain at Fort Bellingham at the time that Lincoln was elected. These guys are going to have to make some pretty serious, they're military men, but they're going to have to make some pretty serious choices about where they're going to fight. Here, that they're going to go fight for the Confederacy, of course. Now, Governor Isaac Stevens, when he was governor, was not with the military, but he had been. He was a graduate of West Point, and he decided to go back into the military to fight for the Union. He unfortunately was killed at the Battle of Chantilly. Granville Haller, as you know, was not killed, but he did decide to fight for the Union. He was not a graduate of West Point, but he'd been in the military for some 20 years at this point. And I'll point out that the Democratic Party at this point is going to be fractured into several pods, I guess. Those who go to fight for the Confederacy, obviously that's the most radical end of the Democratic Party, but then there are these war Democrats or copperheads like Stevens and Haller, who are not in any way interested in abolishing slavery, but they are committed to the Union. They love the Union, they want to support the Union, but they have no taste for an anti-slavery president like Lincoln. The press is fabulous. The Republicans write that the Democrats are ravenous for loaves and fishes, and if their demands are not satisfied, we expect some of them will go over to Jeff Davis's side of the house. So the Democrats, even if they are not fighting for the Confederacy, nobody trusts their patriotism. The Democrats fire back about the Republicans in the Washington Territory. They act as if their very feet were contaminated by contact with our soil, and their souls vulgarized by mingling with the plebeian throng, who, in their opinion, have peopled the benighted regions. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? So the Civil War is definitely going to have an impact on the relations between Great Britain and the United States. Some of you may be familiar with the Trent Affair, which happened on the east, on the Atlantic, when a ship taking 2 Confederate agents to Great Britain to try to lobby for support was intercepted by our old friend Charles Wilkes with the U.S. Navy, and they were apprehended and taken back to I'm not sure where exactly in the United States they were taken, I'm sorry, but this was considered a huge affront to Great Britain, and so that it's a big clash of philosophy between the United States and Great Britain. The United States was always fearful that Great Britain would support the Confederacy, mostly because of trade, cotton mills, that kind of thing. So James Douglas, however, is going to reveal that not everybody is happy still to this day with where the boundary is. And wouldn't this be a great opportunity with the United States at war to see if we can't spread our wings a little bit here in the Northwest? And so he tries to write to his superiors in England, there is no reason why we should not push overland from Puget Sound and establish advanced posts on the Columbia River, maintaining it as a permanent frontier. With Puget Sound and the line of the Columbia River in our hands, we should hold the only navigable outlets of the country, command its trade, and soon compel it to submit to Her Majesty's rule. Because they don't have enough to worry about, right? So the Victoria Colonist, which is a newspaper of the Times, wrote in 1862, Victoria was a hotbed of secessionists, many of whom had been driven from the United States on account of their disunion sentiments. A secessionist named Shepard opened a saloon on Langley Street and erected a flagstaff in front from which he kept flying night and day a Confederate flag. So we talked a little bit about how Governor Douglas was trying to attract African-American refugees to come settle on Vancouver Island. At the time, though, the start of the Civil War, 1/4 of the population of Victoria is Southern sympathizers. Another 1/4 is free African-Americans. So Victoria is small, but it's a very lively place culturally. And it's this kind of presence of these secessionists that's going to drive a lot of fear and paranoia here on Puget Sound. So sorry for so much text, but I think it's jaw-dropping about the Confederacy and Victoria. So this is Washington's territorial governor, William Pickering, writing to U.S. Secretary of State William Seward. The American citizens in Victoria agreed to join in on the occasion of the birthday of the Prince of Wales. They had cheerfully hoisted every American flag in the city when, to their surprise and mortification, a large sprinkling of American secessionists and rebel sympathizers who had fled to Victoria hoisted a Jeff Davis rebel flag in a central part of the city and secured some police officers to prevent its being taken down by the loyal American citizens. After that time, the said rebel flag was frequently hoisted, and that place was considered the headquarters of American secessionists. Several rebel flags are used as objects of attraction for customers, for business purposes. There is a great danger of loyal American citizens being butchered in the streets of Victoria by the rebels who impudently and insolently hoist their rebel colors. Who knew? The press up in Victoria was constantly throwing out conspiracy theories about plots, Confederate privateers that are going to be launched here, Confederate commodores that come with a commission to be outfitted with a warship for the Confederacy through Victoria. The Navy gets so alarmed that from San Francisco, they send up the USS Saginaw to not just to patrol Puget Sound in 1863, but to see if there's anything to be learned about conspiracies going on to try to seize American vessels and convert them to Confederate privateers. And the reason for fears of Confederate privateers was because there's a lot of gold coming out of California. Wherever there's mining, wherever there are gold rushes, there is gold that's being put on ships to be taken back east. And the opportunity for Confederate raiders to seize that gold to fund their war chests is a very real threat in their minds. So it's hard to believe, but we've got some pretty heavy players that are engaged in this conspiracy research. Alan Francis was the consul, the American consul in Victoria, who was a good friend of Lincoln's and had been appointed by him. William Seward, the Secretary of State, James Douglas, Governor of British Columbia, and Richard Lyons, the British envoy to the United States, are all in frequent correspondence about the threat of Confederate privateers in the Pacific Northwest. When the ridiculous suddenly seems possible is true. Out of San Francisco, the J.P. Chapman was a ship that had been seized on its way out into the ocean, and it was found on board. There were secessionist planners of the Knights of the Golden Circle who had plans to seize either the Shubrick or another American vessel to convert it into a raider for the Confederacy. So the fact that they actually found plotters and evidence of a serious plot only fed this fear. It sends poor U.S. Consul Alan Francis, who historians often consider him the Chicken Little of what's going on out here, because he's always afraid something bad is about to happen. But there's plenty of evidence to give him reasons to be afraid. But he's writing back once again to Washington, D.C. There is still in this city a rebel organization. They are awaiting, it seems, from rumors, the receipt of letters of marque from the president of the so-called Confederate States. At this moment, an English steamer called the Fusiyama is expected in this port from England, and it is rumored that she is to be purchased for a privateer. So worried was the military at this that Brigadier General Benjamin Alvord, who was in charge of the Army here in the Pacific Northwest, he had 3 requests for Columbia River defense, the building of Fort Stevens, the building of Fort Cape Disappointment, and a U.S. ironclad. Now, if you've been to the mouth of the Columbia, you know there is a Fort Stevens and there is a Fort Cape Disappointment. So those forts were literally built to protect from potential privateering raids at the mouth of the Columbia, though they never saw any action. So I think the last one, this came out of the Seattle Gazette, which was a Republican newspaper. They wrote, this is 1864, so a year before the end of the war, the possibility of the Confederate States Navy war steamer Alabama paying a visit to Puget Sound is sneered at by some, but if the pirate visits this coast, he will come to Puget Sound. In 1 week, the Alabama could destroy a dozen sawmills of more than $1 million in value. She could literally wipe out every town upon the borders of Puget Sound. So are you ready for some good trash talk by the press?
Sure.
There's not even any pictures for this, but they're so great. Talk about fake news. So the Washington Standard was a Republican newspaper, founded soon after Lincoln was elected. And they wrote in 1861, and they're talking really about copperheads, right? The Democrats who are not joining the Confederacy, but are not really supporting the North either. The Northern traitor lacks the courage to join his secession friends in the South and fight boldly for the cause. Too many of these drones inhabit the Pacific coast, and they should join their secession friends in the sunny South, where they can find a more congenial climate. This country has had enough of them. They are as full of Virginia pride and South Carolina logic as a hog of fleas. They smell of cotton confederacies and Negro monarchies. The North don't want them, and Jeff Davis does. He lacks soldiers, and their carcasses will fill a pit just as well as those of other men. So, if you think our civil discourse is bad now, and yet it worked both ways. The Democrats weren't going to take that lying down, right? So our nation, the grandest and best that ever existed, is at this moment in the terrible agony of life and death. Millions of men, women, and children are at the mercy of the black wave of fanaticism, which threatens the utter ruin of all the hopes, pride, and liberty of our race. Awake, ye sons and daughters of liberty-loving, patriotic white men. We want no beating about the bush, but a frank, manly, open avowal of principles. This government was intended as a white man's government. Yikes. But this is without a doubt my favorite. The same paper about Abraham Lincoln. We learned from what we consider as reliable a source as is possible to find among the Republicans that old Abe shall soon get a divorce from his white wife and take unto himself a sable wench to begin the great work of miscegenation. I think they were misinformed. They were misinformed. So this is really, you'll see this again and again in their writings. They are really worried almost more than anything about racial mixing. It's not so much the freedom, it's the impurification, I should say, of the race. So what about our EB boys? Where do they stand in all of this? Well, to be honest, it brings a tear to my eye. They are copperheads for the most part. They are not secessionists. They are Union men, but they're not interested in the abolition of slavery or voting rights and full equality for African Americans. So there is a point in Missouri where General J.C. Fremont declares martial law, and Winfield writes about it in his journal. General J.C. Fremont has declared martial law over the state of Missouri, confiscating the property of persons adhering south, declaring the slaves belonging to such to be free men, etc. It is impossible to foresee what the country is coming to or when and how things will end. The abolition of slavery, I have always believed to be the true cause on the part of the Republican Party, and recent events, I think, justify that opinion. This proceeding in Missouri is a prelude to more serious demonstrations against slave property at the South. So this is where the Army is seizing slaves of their enemy, of the rebels, and liberating them. And this is not going over well. The Republicans, to get elected, had to maintain that their sole goal was to preserve the Union. It's years before they're going to come out and really push anti-slavery as part of the purpose of the war. So Winfield is basically saying here, they never had me fooled. I always knew it was about slavery. So he has, however, a cousin. Now, there were a number of cousins of the Ebys that came out with them out here. One was George Eby, and another was George Beam. And the two Georges had a land claim over on Protection Island. They tried to farm Protection Island. You all know where Protection Island is? Protection Island is, if you are looking across at Eby's Landing towards the lighthouse, you might have seen a large island off to the right up the straits a bit. It's a wildlife refuge now. You can't go there and walk around. It's just for, it's protected. But they tried to farm there. George Eby was very much a supporter of Lincoln. In fact, he said in one of his letters to Winfield that if he ever has a child, whether it's a girl or a boy, he's going to name it Abraham Lincoln. So his letters to Winfield, he actually goes back, he leaves, he wants to fight for the Union. He goes back to Illinois, which is where his family was. There's a whole wing of Ebys in Illinois. And he signs up, as do several of their cousins, to fight for the Union as Illinois volunteers. George is always trying to convince Winfield that his politics need to be rectified. So he writes in one letter early on in the war, "I was pained to learn that you have taken a position antagonistic to the interests of our country, and that you sympathize with treason and rebellion. When I would much rather you would never send me a paper or write me a line, if everything you send must contain something of treason. I love my friends, but when they, of their own free will, choose to fight against the best country God ever made, then I wash my hands and say goodbye." However, he kept writing. We don't have Winfield's responses. George Eby was actually with the Army, traveling with the Army when he wrote this. So the letters whatever happened to the letters he received from Winfield, we don't have them. He wrote again in a different letter, "Our family is again thrown into mourning. Brother Fletcher and Uncle Thomas were both killed at the terrible Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, or Shiloh, as it is officially called. They both did their duty nobly and fell fighting for the maintenance of the Union they loved so well. It was a terrific battle. In my company, the loss was 19 killed and wounded out of 53 that went into the fight. I was very lucky and passed through unharmed until 2 o'clock on Monday afternoon, when a Minnie ball struck me in the left breast, inflicting a severe but not mortal wound. I have now been suffering 4 weeks, but am much better. Hope to rejoin my regiment in a week or two." So he is not deterred. And now a word from our sponsors. This is a little segue because I have to. As we try to save Granville Haller's house here in Coupeville, we might wonder what's going on with the major while he's out there. Haller was the commandant of General George McClellan's headquarters guard. So he was basically in charge of the bureaucratic end, but he was on the campaigns, the Peninsula campaigns, the Maryland campaigns with McClellan's army. And he's going to have a bad experience in 1863, which I'm going to get into in a minute, because he was a Democrat in the Copperhead in Lincoln's army. And so if you know anything about George McClellan, he and Lincoln did not get along. McClellan could build a great army, but maybe was a little slow by Lincoln standards to actually use it. He was dismissed twice. And after the second time, McClellan decided that he was going to run against Lincoln for president for re-election in 1864, which he did. Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, Stanton, was convinced that George McClellan was organizing a coup to overtake the government from Lincoln. And so he embarked on a purge of the army to get rid of people who he thought might be willing to support McClellan in this coup. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened in that, but he writes to Grant, when Haller left to go back east to fight for the Union, he had bought farmland at Crescent Harbor, just east of Oak Harbor, and he had left the management of it in the hands of Winfield. And so they were in correspondence throughout the war. And after his dismissal, very shortly after his dismissal, he wrote to Eby that he thought he'd be coming back. The family all wanted to come back to Whidbey Island. And he wrote, "The army is gradually being thinned of officers who are uncompromising in their devotion to the Constitution as it is." And you know what that means, right? No equality for slaves. Or opposed to Negro equality and amalgamation. Unless something in providence of God turns up to lead us in the right direction, I fear the Constitution will be reconstructed to suit abolitionists, and there will be such outbursts of indignation from the people that a revolution equally disastrous as the present rebellion will be set in motion, and God only can tell where it will be terminated. So this is where I point out that the study of history and the celebration of history are not the same thing. We study what he thought. The press was merciless with Lincoln often, but the Democratic press that loved McClellan had a field day with him, and the Republicans did also. That's a little teeny tiny George McClellan in Lincoln's hands. So just before he was let go, and why he couldn't believe he'd actually been let go, even though he knew he was not a Lincoln man, was Haller was from York, Pennsylvania. And York, Pennsylvania, can you see my cursor? Yeah. Okay. York, Pennsylvania is right here. Here's Gettysburg. And here's Baltimore and DC down here. So when the Confederates start to come up towards Gettysburg, they're not headed for Gettysburg. They're headed to the Pennsylvania state capital here in Harrisburg. And if it goes really well, they're going to go on to Philadelphia. But what they have to do to get to Harrisburg is to cross the Susquehanna River, which is a pretty big river. And Haller just happens to be on sick leave as the Jubal Early's army, Confederate army, is pushing into Pennsylvania for the first time. And so he is brought out of sick leave to organize local volunteers, because the army can't get up there fast enough to stop Jubal Early's army from getting over the Susquehanna and marching on Harrisburg. So Haller's going to take the charge. He's going to organize volunteers, and he knows this is York, where the action is going to take place. Here's the Susquehanna. He knows that the only way to keep the Confederates from crossing the Susquehanna, because he's only got a handful of men compared to the Confederate army, is to burn this bridge, the Columbia-Wrightsville Bridge, which is a mile long. It's a covered bridge, and it is the only way to cross the river to get to Harrisburg way up here. So Haller is famous for this. He and his men burned the Columbia River Bridge over the Susquehanna, and the truth is the Confederate army never got to Harrisburg. They had to turn around and go back, and that's when they went to Gettysburg. So Haller was not attached to a unit at that time because he'd been on sick leave, and McClellan had been cashiered. So he took his son Morris, who was, I think, 12 years old, and they went and observed in nearby Gettysburg what went on. I can't find anything that says either of them did any fighting, but they were both there. But at any rate, General Jubal Early of the Confederate Army said that I regretted very much the failure to secure this bridge, finding the defenseless condition of the country generally and the little obstacle likely to be afforded by the militia to our progress. So, and the artist who did this actually points out that this little guy on horseback here is Haller. Gotta say it. So after the Battle of Gettysburg, Haller's probably thinking he's going to get a big commendation, and what he got was dismissed. He dismissed Major Granville Owen Haller, 7th Infantry, from the service for disloyal conduct and utterance of disloyal sentiments. And what purportedly happened is someone who didn't like Haller went into the Secretary of War and said, I heard him make an anti-Lincoln toast in his tent, and he should be cashiered. So Stanton wasn't going to have any of it. He's going to protect his president. It's a very curious thing that he was supposed to have said, because it's not immediately apparent what he means by it. But here's to a Northern Confederation and a Southern one while Lincoln is president. And the most sense you can make out of it is he's hoping that Lincoln fails in his attempt to keep the country unified. Lincoln was not a part of the process. He wasn't happy about the process, but he had bigger things to worry about. But General Henry Halleck, who was apparently there when Stanton and he had the conversation about Haller being dismissed without any charges, no court martial, just you're out, no questions. Thanks for serving for 23 years. Lincoln supposedly said to Stanton, look here, Stanton, I don't think you should have dismissed Major Haller peremptorily. Inasmuch as you can court-martial an officer for making water against a stump when a lady can see him with a telescope, what is the use of dismissing a man without a trial? However, he didn't force the issue. So that's when Haller became a civilian. McClellan, of course, who'd also been similarly exiled, was very sympathetic and wrote, I wish to express my sincere sympathy with you in the persecution you have endured. I know your character too well to wait for a hearing of the case before forming my opinion in the case, for I know that you could not be disloyal to your country. Justice seems for a time to have fled from our unhappy country, but I do not yet despair. So there were things that might be called suspension of civil liberties that went on during the war. So back here, that's the promo. The special promo is now over. While all this is going on, you may have heard of Asa Mercer and the Mercer girls. So the reason Asa Mercer went back east when he did and where he went to get brides for all the white settlers out here was because the textile mills in New England had all been closed down because there was no longer any access to Southern cotton. The Lowell mills in Massachusetts were a radical innovation for women. We might look back and go, oh my God, that was a sweatshop. But what it did was it gave women independence because they would leave their farms throughout New England and they would come and they'd live in the dormitories where all the women worked, but they had the opportunity to take classes, to go to cultural events, to publish their own newspapers. It gave them agency. They were earning their own money. They got to keep the money. The conditions were hard. They worked 6 days a week. But and they worked long days in pretty unpleasant conditions in the mills. But for most of them, it was better than being stuck at the farm basically, the farm slave. So they were, Asa Mercer understood that these very independent women might be just the kind of adventurous women who would be willing to come to the West. And he wasn't wrong. So here's, some of you may know the story of Daniel Pearson. Daniel Pearson worked at the Lowell mills in Massachusetts, and he came out with the Mercer expeditions. He had a couple of daughters. He came first with oh God, Lee, help me. Is it Georgiana? Who was the Mercer girl? The Pearson daughter. Flora came later. Flora came later. She was not technically a Mercer girl, but I think the older sister came with the expedition. Did you say Georgiana? Georgia. Okay. And so that was what brought the Engels out here, was the closing of the Lowell mills. He came out here. He was a Republican, which was the right thing to be when Abraham Lincoln was president. And so he was able to secure a post as the Admiralty head lighthouse keeper. And of course, his younger daughter, Flora, was his assistant. The picture that you see on the left there, she later married William Engel, who was one of the earliest settlers and land claimants here. Before the women came, one person was directed to try to find William Engel's farm and was told, you won't be able to miss it. Lots of dogs, no women. So the death of Lincoln, how did the people of Whidbey Island respond to the death of Lincoln? The truth is that the course of the war had softened politics here. The virulent element of hatred for Abraham Lincoln had either been smothered or had softened. It was a big event for them. And when they heard it, as you can see from this clipping from the Seattle Gazette, that the news of the war ending, of Lee's surrendering to Grant, and the news of the assassination showed up on the same day. And George Kellogg, our one of our earlier historians, right? Albert Kellogg, then a young boy of 12, tells of coming down the road with a group of children, all just released from school, and meeting a farmer who announced to them the death of Lincoln. The gaiety of the afternoon disappeared, and they went home oppressed, talking of the tragedy in lowered voices. So all those Democrats had changed their tune a little bit.